The 33 sermons on Nibbāna were delivered by the Venerable Bhikkhu Kaṭukurunde Ñāṇananda in Sinhala at Mitrigala Nissaranavanaya Forest Hermitage. They were translated into English by the same Venerable monk, presently residing at Potkulkala Forest Hermitage in Kandagedara Devalagam.
Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Etang santang, etang panitang, yadidang sabba sankhara samato, sabbo padhipati nisaggo, tanhakhayo, virago, nirodho, nibbāna. This is peaceful, this is excellent, namely, the stilling of all preparations, the relinquishment of all assets, the destruction of craving, detachment, cessation, extinction. With the permission of the most venerable great preceptor and the assembly of the venerable meditative monks, the second sermon on Nibbāna has come up for today. Towards the end of our sermon the other day, we raised the point. Why is it improper to ask such questions as, what is the purpose of Nibbāna? Why should one attain Nibbāna? Our explanation was that since the holy life or the Noble Eightfold Path has Nibbāna as its ultimate aim, since it gets merged in Nibbāna, any questions as to the ultimate purpose of Nibbāna would be inappropriate. In fact, at some places in the canon, we find the phrase Anuttara Brahmacharya Pariyosana used with reference to Nibbāna. It means that Nibbāna is the supreme consummation of the holy life. The following standard phrase announcing a new Arahant is very often found in the suttas. Yasathai kulaputta sammadevagarasmanagaryam pabbajanti tadanuttarang brahmacharya pariyosanam dittheva dhammi sayang abhinya satchigatva upasampadya vihasi. In this very life, he realized by his own higher knowledge and attained to that supreme consummation of the holy life, for the purpose of which clansmen of good family rightly go forth from home to homelessness. Now what is the justification for saying that one attains to Nibbāna by the very completion of the holy life? This Noble Eightfold Path is a straight path. Ujjuko nama somago, abhaya nama sadisa. This path is called the straight, and the direction it goes is called the fearless. In the Itivuttaka, we come across a verse which expresses this idea more vividly. Sekassa sikkhamanassa ujjumaggānusārino kayasmin patamang ñāṇaṁ tato aññā anantara. The learner, learning in pursuit of the straight path, first comes the knowledge of destruction and then immediately the certitude. It is the fruit of arahantship which gives him the certitude of the attainment of Nibbāna. Here the word anantara has been used. That concentration proper to the fruit of arahantship is called anantariko samadhi. This means that the attainment of the fruit is immediate. Though it may be so in the case of the arahant, what about the stream winner, the sotapanna, one may ask? There is a general belief that in the case of a sotapanna, the vision of Nibbāna is like a glimpse of a distant lamp on a road with many bends, and the sotapanna has just negotiated the first bend. But in accordance with the Dhamma, it may be said that the norm of immediacy is applicable even to the knowledge of the first path. One who attains to the fruit of stream winning may be a beggar, an illiterate person, or a 7-year-old child. It may be that he has heard the Dhamma for the first time. All the same, A long line of epithets is used with reference to him in the suttas as his qualifications. Ditta Dhammo, Patta Dhammo, Vidita Dhammo, Pariyogal Dhammo, Tinna Vichikicho, Vigataka Thankatho, Vesarajapatto, Aprapatyo Sattusar. Ditta Dhammo. He is one who has seen the Dhamma, the truth of Nibbāna. It is said in the Ratana Sutta that along with the vision of the first path, 3 fetters are abandoned, namely Sakkaya Diṭṭhi, the selfhood whip, Vicikicca, skeptical doubt, and Silabbata Paramasa, attachment to holy vows and ascetic practices. Some might argue that only these fetters are abandoned at this stage because it is a glimpse of Nibbāna from a distance. But then there is this second epithet, Patta Dhamma, which means that he has reached the Dhamma, that he has arrived at Nibbāna. Not only that, he is Vidita Dhammo, he is one who has understood the Dhamma, which is Nibbāna. He is Pariyogala Dhammo, he has plunged into the Dhamma, he has dived into the Dhamma, which is Nibbāna. He is Tinna Vicikiccho, he has crossed over doubts. Vigataka Thankatho, his waverings are gone. Vesarajapattu, he has attained to proficiency. Aprapatyo Sattusasana, in regard to the dispensation of the teacher, he is not dependent on others. And that is to say, that he could attain to Nibbāna even without another's help, though of course, with the teacher's help, he would attain it soon. So this string of epithets testifies to the efficacy of the realization by the first path. It is not a mere glimpse of Nibbāna from a distance. It is a reaching, an arrival, or plunge into Nibbāna. For purposes of illustration, we may bring in a legend connected with the history of Sri Lanka. It is said that when King Gajabahu invaded India, one of his soldiers, Nila, who had Herculean strength, parted the sea water with a huge iron bar in order to make way for the king and the army. Now when the supramundane path arises in the mind, the power of thought is as mighty as the blow of Nila with his iron bar. Even with the first blow, the sea water parted so that one could see the bottom. Similarly, the sweeping influxes are parted for a moment when the transcendental path arises in the mind, enabling one to see the very bottom, Nibbāna. In other words, all preparations, sankharas, are stilled for a moment, enabling one to see the cessation of preparations. We have just given a simile by way of illustration. But incidentally, there is a Dhammapada verse which comes closer to it. Chinda sotang parakkamma kame panuda brahmana sankharanam kayam nyatva akatanyosi brahmana. Strive forth and cut off the stream, discard, O Brahmin, sense desires. Having known the destruction of preparations, O Brahmin, become a knower of the unmade. So this verse clearly indicates what the knowledge of the path does when it arises. Just as one leaps forward and cuts off a stream of water, so it cuts off, even for a moment, the preparations connected with craving. Thereby one realizes the destruction of preparations. Sankharana kayam nyatva. Like the sea water parted by the blow of the iron bar, preparations part for a moment to reveal the very bottom, which is unprepared, the asankhata. Akata, or the unmade, is the same as asankhata, the unprepared. So one has had a momentary vision of the sea bottom, which is free from preparations. Of course, after the experience, influxes flow in again. But one kind of influxes, namely the tasava, influxes of vibes, are gone for good and will never flow again. Now how was it that some with keen wisdom like Bahya attained arahantship even while listening to a short sermon from the Buddha? They had dealt 4 powerful blows in quick succession with the iron bar of the path knowledge to clear away all possible influxes. What is called akata or asankhata the unmade or the unprepared, is not something out there in a distance, as an object of thought. It is not a sign to be grasped by one who wants to attain Nibbāna. Language encourages us to think in terms of signs. Very often, we find it difficult to get rid of this habit. The worldlings, with their defilements, have to communicate with each other, and the structure of the language has to answer their needs. So the subject-object relationship has become a very significant feature in a language. It always carries the implication that there is a thing to be grasped, and that there is someone who grasps, that there is a doer and a thing done. So it is almost impossible to avoid such usages as, I want to see Nibbāna, I want to attain Nibbāna. We are made to think in terms of getting and attaining. However, sometimes the Buddha reminds us that this is only a conventional usage, and that these worldly usages are not to be taken too seriously. We come across such an instance in the Sagatha Vagga of the Samyutta Nikaya, where the Buddha retorts to some questions put by a certain deity. The deity named Kaṭukurunde asked the Buddha, "Do you rejoice, or recluse?" And the Buddha retorts, "On getting what, friend?" Then the deity asks, "Then, recluse, do you grieve?" And the Buddha quips back, "On losing what, friend?" So the deity concludes, "Well, then, recluse, you neither rejoice nor grieve." And the Buddha replies, "That is so, friend." It seems then that though we say we attain Nibbāna, there is nothing to gain and nothing to lose. If anything, what is lost is an ignorance that there is something, and a craving that there is not enough. And that is all one loses. Now there are quite a number of synonyms for Nibbāna, such as akata and asankata. As already mentioned, there is even a list of 33 such epithets, out of which one is Deepa. Now Deepa means an island. When we are told that Nibbāna is an island, we tend to imagine some sort of existence in a beautiful island. But in the Parayana Vagga of the Sutta Nibbāna, the Buddha gives a good corrective to that kind of imagining in his reply to a question put by the Brahman youth Kappa, a pupil of Bhavai. Kappa puts his question in the following impressive verse. Majje sarasming tittadam odhe jate mahabhaye jaramachu paretanang deepang pabruhi marisad tvancame deepang akkahi yataidam naparansya. Unto them that stand midstream, when the frightful floods flow forth, to them in decay and death fall on, an island, sire, may you proclaim. An island which none else excels. Yeah, such an island, pray tell me, sire. And the Buddha gives this answer in two inspiring verses. Majje sarasming tittadam odhe jate mahabhaye jaramachu paretanang deepang pabrumi kapati. Akinchanang anadanang etang deepang anaparang nibbānamiti nang brumi jaramachu parikhyam. Unto them that stand midstream, when the frightful floods flow forth, to them in decay and death fall on, an island Kappa I shall proclaim. Owning not, grasping not, the isle is this, none else besides. Nibbāna, that is how I call that isle, wherein is decay decayed, and death is dead. Akinchanang means owning nothing. Anadanang means grasping nothing. Etang deepang anaparang. This is the island, nothing else. Nibbānamiti nang brumi jaramachu parikhyam. And that I call Nibbāna, which is the extinction of decay and death. From this also we can infer that words like akata, asankata and sabbasankhara samatha are full-fledged synonyms of Nibbāna. Nibbāna is not some mysterious state quite apart from them. It is not something to be projected into a distance. Some are in the habit of getting down to a discussion on Nibbāna by putting sankhata on one side and asankhata on the other side. They start by saying that sankhata or the prepared is anicca or impermanent. If Sankhata is Anicca, they conclude that Asankhata must be Nicca. That is, the unprepared must be permanent. Following the same line of argument, they argue that since Sankhata is Dukkha, Asankhata must be Sukha. But when they come to the third step, they get into difficulties. If Sankhata is Anatta or not self, then surely Asankhata must be Atta or self. At this point, they have to admit that their argument is too facile, and so they end up by saying that after all, Nibbāna is something to be realized. All this confusion arises due to a lack of understanding of the law of dependent arising, paticcasamuppada. Therefore, first of all, we have to say something about the doctrine of paticcasamuppada. According to the Arya Pariyesana Sutta of the Majjhima Nikaya, the Buddha, soon after his enlightenment, reflected on the profundity of the Dhamma and was rather disinclined to preach it. He saw 2 points in the doctrine that are difficult for the world to see or grasp. One was paticcasamuppada. Duddhasamnidam thanam yadidam idappaccheta paticcasamuppada. Hard to see is this point, namely dependent arising, which is a relatedness of this to that. And the second point was Nibbāna. Idam bhikkho thanam duddhasam yadidam sabba sankhara samatho sabbo patipati saggo tanhakyo virago nirodho Nibbāna. And this point too is difficult to see, namely the stilling of all preparations, the relinquishment of all assets, the destruction of craving, detachment, cessation, extinction. From this context, we can gather that if there is any term we can use to define paticcasamuppada, a term that comes closer to it in meaning, it is idappaccheta. The Buddha himself has described paticcasamuppada in this context as a relatedness of this to that, idappaccheta. As a matter of fact, the basic principle which forms the noble norm of this doctrine of dependent arising is this idappaccheta. Let us now try to get at its meaning by examining the doctrine of paticcasamuppada. In quite a number of contexts, such as the Bahudhatuka Sutta of the Majjhima Nikaya and the Bodhivagga of the Udana, the law of paticcasamuppada is set out in the following manner. Imasmin sati idang hoti, imas suppada idang uppadati, imasmin asati idang nahoti, imassa nirodha idang nirujjati. Yadidam avijjāpaccaya sankhara, sankharapaccaya viññānam, viññānapaccaya nāmarūpaṃ, nārūpaccaya salayatanam, salayatanapaccaya phasso, phassapaccaya vedana, vedanapaccaya tanha, tanhapaccaya upādānam, upādānapaccaya bhavo, bhavapaccaya jāti, jātipaccaya jarāmaranam, soka parideva dukkha domanam supāyāsā sambhavanti. Evametasya kevalasya dukkha khandasya samudayo hoti. Avidyāyattva sesa viraga nirodha, sankhara nirodho, sankhara nirodha, viññāna nirodho, viññāna nirodha, nāmarupa nirodho, nāmarupa nirodha, salayata nirodho, salayata nirodha, phassa nirodho, phassa nirodha, vedana nirodho, vedana nirodha, tanha nirodho, tanha nirodha, upādāna nirodho, upādāna nirodha, bhava nirodho, bhava nirodha, jāti nirodho, jāti nirodha, jarāmaranam, soka parideva dukkha domana supāyāsā nirujjanti. Evametasya kevalasya dukkha khandasya nirodho hoti. Thus, this being, this comes to be. With the arising of this, this arises. This not being, this does not come to be. With the cessation of this, this ceases. And that is to say, dependent on ignorance, preparations come to be. Dependent on preparations, consciousness. Dependent on consciousness, name and form. Dependent on name and form, the six sense bases. Dependent on the six sense bases, contact. Dependent on contact, feeling. Dependent on feeling, craving. Dependent on craving, grasping. Dependent on grasping, becoming. Dependent on becoming, birth. Dependent on birth, decay and death. Sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief and despair come to be. This is the arising of this entire mass of suffering. But with the complete fading away and cessation of ignorance comes the cessation of preparation. With the cessation of preparations, the cessation of consciousness. With the cessation of consciousness, the cessation of name and form. With the cessation of name and form, the cessation of the six sense bases. With the cessation of the six sense bases, the cessation of contact. With the cessation of contact, the cessation of feeling. With the cessation of feeling, the cessation of craving. With the cessation of craving, the cessation of grasping. With the cessation of grasping, the cessation of becoming. With the cessation of becoming, the cessation of birth. With the cessation of birth, the cessation of decay and death, sorrow, lamentation, pain, grief, and despair cease to be. Thus is the cessation of this entire mass of suffering. This is the thematic statement of the law of Paṭiccsamuppada. It is set out here in the form of a fundamental principle. Imasmic sati idang hoti. This being, this comes to be. Imasuppada idang uppadyati. With the arising of this arises. Imasmic asati idang nahoti. This not being, this does not come to be. Imassa nirodha idang nirujjati. With the cessation of this ceases. It resembles an algebraical formula. And then we have the conjunctive yadidam, which means namely this, or that is to say. This shows that the foregoing statement is axiomatic and implies that what follows is an illustration. So the 12-linked formula beginning with the words avijja paccaya sankhara is that illustration. No doubt, the 12-linked formula is impressive enough. But the important thing here is the basic principle involved, and that is the fourfold statement beginning with imasmic sati. This fact is very clearly brought out in a certain sutta in the Nibbāna Vagga of the Samyutta Nikāya. There the Buddha addresses the monks and says, Paticcasamuppadanca vo bhikkhave desisami paticcasamuppanneca dhamme. Monks, I will teach you dependent arising and things that are dependently arisen. In this particular context, the Buddha makes a distinction between dependent arising and things that are dependently arisen. In order to explain what is meant by dependent arising or Paticcasamuppada, he takes up the last two links in the formula in the words Jati paccaya bhikkhave jara marana. Monks dependent on birth, decay and death. Then he draws attention to the importance of the basic principle involved. Pādāva tathāgatānaṁ anuppādāva tathāgatānaṁ Thitava sadhatu dhammattitata dhammaniyamata idapaccayata, etc. Out of the long exhortation given there, this is the part relevant to us here. Jati paccaya bhikkhave jara maranam, dependent on birth or monks is decay and death. And that is to say that decay and death has birth as its condition. Uppadāva tathāgatānaṁ anuppādāva tathāgatānaṁ, whether there be an arising of the Tathagatas or whether there be no such arising. Thitava sadhatu dhammattitata dhammaniyamata idapaccayata. That elementary nature, that orderliness of the Dhamma, that norm of the Dhamma, the relatedness of this to that does stand as it is. So from this it is clear that the underlying principle could be understood even with the help of a couple of links. But the commentary seems to have ignored this fact in its definition of the term idapaccayata. It says, Imesang jaramarnādīnaṁ paccaya idapaccaya, idapaccayāva idapaccayata. The word imesang is in the plural, and this indicates that the commentator has taken the dependence in a collective sense. But it is because of the fact that even two links are sufficient to illustrate the law that the Buddha follows it up with the declaration that this is the Paticcasamuppada. And then he goes on to explain what is meant by things dependently arisen. Ataneca bhikkhave paticcasamuppanna dhamma. Jara maranang bhikkhave aniccaṃ sankhatāṃ paticcasamuppannam kaya dhammam vaya dhammam viraga dhammam nirodhatam. What monks are things dependently arisen? And then taking up just one of the last links, he declares, decay and death, monks, is impermanent, prepared, dependently arisen, of a nature to get destroyed, to pass away, fade away, and cease. By the way, the word viraga usually means detachment or dispassion. But in such contexts as avijja viraga and pityaja viraga, one has to render it by words like fading away. So that avidya viraga could be rendered as by the fading away of ignorance, and pritya viraga would mean by the fading away of joy. It seems then that decay and death themselves are impermanent, and that they are prepared or made up, that they are dependently arisen. Decay and death themselves can get destroyed and pass away. Decay as well as death can fade away and cease. Then the Buddha takes up the preceding link, jati or birth. And that too is given the same qualifications. In the same manner he takes up each of the preceding links up to and including ignorance, avijja, and applies to them the above qualifications. It is significant that every one of the 12 links, even ignorance, is said to be dependently arisen. Let us try to understand how, for instance, decay and death themselves can get destroyed or pass away. Taking the Idappacchata formula as a paradigm, we can illustrate the relationship between the two links, birth and decay and death. Instead of saying this being that comes to be and so forth, now we have to say birth being, decay and death comes to be. With the arising of birth, decay and death arises. Birth not being, decay and death does not come to be. With the cessation of birth, decay and death ceases. Now birth itself is an arising. But here we can't help saying that birth arises. It is like saying that birth is born. How can birth get born? Similarly, death is a passing away. But here we have to say that death itself passes away. How can death pass away? Perhaps, as we proceed, we might get the answers to these questions. Now at this point, let us take up for discussion a certain significant passage in the Ñāṇananda Sutta of the Dīgha Nikāya. In the course of an exposition of the law of Paticcasamuppada addressed to Venerable Ñāṇananda, the Buddha makes the following statement. Ettavata ko ānanda jāyethava, jiyethava, miyethava, chavetava, uppajjethava. Ettavata adhivacana patho, ettavata nirutti patho, ettavata paññatti patho, ettavata paññāvacarang, ettavata vattang vattati, ittattang paññāpanāya, yadidang nāmarūpang sahaviññānena. In so far only Ananda can one be born, or grow old, or die, or pass away, or reappear. In so far only is there any pathway for verbal expression. In so far only is there any pathway for terminology. In so far only is there any pathway for designation. In so far only is the range of wisdom. In so far only is the round kept going for there to be a designation as the thisness, that is to say, name and form together with consciousness. We have rendered the term ittatta by thisness, and what it means will become clear as we go on. In the above quotation, the word ettavata, which means in so far only, has as its point of reference the concluding phrase yadidang nāmarūpang sahaviññānena, that is to say, name and form together with consciousness. So the statement as it is expresses a complete idea, but some editions have an additional phrase, anyamanya paccayata pavattati, exists in a mutual relationship. This phrase is obviously superfluous and is probably a commentarial edge. What is meant by the Buddha's statement is that name and form together with consciousness is the rallying point for all concepts of birth, decay, death and rebirth. All pathways for verbal expression, terminology and designation converge on name and form together with consciousness. The range of wisdom extends only up to the relationship between these two. And it is between these two that there is a whirling round, so that one may point out a thisness. In short, the secret of the entire samsaric existence is to be found in this whirlpool. Vatta and avatta are words used for a whirlpool. We shall be bringing up quotations in support of that meaning. It seems, however, that this meaning has got obscured in the course of time. In the commentaries and in some modern translations, there is quite a lot of confusion with regard to the meaning of the phrase vattang vattati. In fact, one Sinhala translation renders it as samsaric rain. What rain has to do with samsara is a matter for conjecture. What is actually meant by vattang vattati is a whirling round, and samsara, even literally, is that. Here we are told that there is a whirling round between name and form and consciousness, And this is the samsaric whirlpool to which all the opposite things are traceable. Already in the first sermon, we tried to show that name in name and form has to do with names and concepts. Now, from this context, it becomes clear that all pathways for verbal expression, terminology, and designation converge on this whirlpool between name and form and consciousness. Now that we have attached so much significance to a whirlpool, let us try to understand how a whirlpool is formed. Let us try to get at the natural laws underlying its formation. How does a whirlpool come to be? Suppose a river is flowing downward. To flow downward is in the nature of a river. But a certain current of water thinks, I can and must move upstream. And so it pushes on against the mainstream. But at a certain point, its progress is checked by the mainstream and is thrust aside, only to come round and make a fresh attempt again and again. All these obstinate and unsuccessful attempts gradually lead to a whirling round. As time goes on, the runaway current understands, as it were, that it cannot move forward. But it does not give up. It finds an alternative way in moving towards the bottom. So it spirals downward, funnel-like, digging deeper and deeper towards the bottom, until an abyss is formed. Here then we have a whirlpool. While all this is going on, there is a crying need to fill up the chasm, and the whirlpool develops the necessary force of attraction to cater to it. It attracts and grasps everything that comes within its reach, and sends it whirling down funnel-like into the chasm. The whirling goes on at a tremendous speed, while the circumference grows larger and larger. At last, the whirlpool becomes a center of a tremendous amount of activity. While this kind of activity is going on in a river or sea, there is a possibility for us to point it out as that place or this place. Why? Because there is an activity going on. Usually in the world, the place where an activity is going on is known as a unit, a center, or an institution. Since the whirlpool is also a center of activity, we may designate it as a here or there. We may even personify it. With reference to it, we can open up pathways for verbal expression, terminology, and designation. But if we are to consider the form of activity that is going on here, what is it after all? It is only a perversion. That obstinate current thought to itself, out of delusion and ignorance, I can and must move upstream. And so it tried and failed, but turned round only to make the same vain attempt again and again. Ironically enough, even its progress towards the bottom is a stagnation. So here we have ignorance on one side and craving on the other, as a result of the abyss formed by the whirlpool. In order to satisfy this craving, there is that power of attraction, grasping. Where there is grasping, there is existence, or power. The entire whirlpool now appears as a center of activity. Now the basic principle underlying this whirlpool is to be found in our bodies. What we call breathing is a continuous process of emptying and filling up. So even the so-called life principle is not much different from the activity of a whirlpool. The functioning of the lungs and heart is based on the same principle, and the blood circulation is in fact a whirling round. This kind of activity is very often known as automatic, a word which has connotations of self-sufficiency. But at the root of it there is a perversion, as we saw in the case of the whirlpool. All these activities are based on a conflict between two opposite forces. In fact, existence in its entirety is not much different from the conflict of that obstinate current of water with the mainstream. This characteristic of conflict is so pervasive that it can be seen even in the basic laws governing the existence of a society. In our social life, rights and responsibilities go hand in hand. We can enjoy certain privileges provided we fulfill our duties. So here too we have a tangle within and a tangle without. Now this is about the existence of the society as such. And what about the field of economics? There too, the basic principles show the same weakness. Production is governed by laws of supply and demand. There will be a supply so long as there is a demand. Between them there is a conflict. It leads to many complications. The price mechanism is on a precarious balance, and that is why some wealthy countries are forced to the ridiculous position of dumping their surplus into the sea. All this shows that existence is basically in a precarious position. To illustrate this, let us take the case of two snakes of the same size, trying to swallow up each other. Each of them tries to swallow up the other from the tail upwards, and when they are halfway through the meal, what do we find? A snake cycle. This snake cycle goes round and round, trying to swallow up each other. But will it ever be successful? The precarious position illustrated by the snake cycle we find in our own bodies in the form of respiration, blood circulation, and so forth. What appears as the stability in the society and in the economy is similarly precarious. It is because of this conflict, this unsatisfactoriness, that the Buddha concluded that the whole of existence is suffering. When the arising aspect is taken too seriously, to the neglect of the cessation aspect, instead of a conflict or an unsatisfactoriness, one tends to see something automatic everywhere. This body, as well as machines such as water pumps and electrical appliances, seem to work on an automatic principle. But in truth, there is only a conflict between two opposing forces. When one comes to think of it, there is no autonomous even in the automatic. All that is there is a bearing up with difficulty. And this, in fact, is the meaning of the word dukkha. Dukh stands for difficulty, and kha for bearing up. Even with difficulty, one bears it up. And though one bears it up, it is difficult. Now, regarding the question of existence, we happen to mention that because of a whirlpool's activity, one can point out a here with reference to it. We can now come back to the word ittattam, which we left out without comment in the quotation ettavata vattang vattati ittattam paññāpana. In so far only does the whirlpool whirl for the designation of an ittatta. Now what is this ittatta? Itta means this, so ittattam would mean thisness. The whirling of a whirlpool qualifies itself for a designation as a this. There are a couple of verses in the Dvaitanupassana Sutta of the Sutta Nipāta which bring out the meaning of this word more clearly. Jati marana sangsarang ye vajanti punah punang ittha bhavanya tha bhavang avijja eva sabati. Tanha dutiyo puriso dighamadhana sangsarang ittha bhavanya tha bhavang sangsarang nati vattati. Ye jati marana sangsarang punah punang vajanti. They that go on again and again the round of birth and death. Ittha bhavanya tha bhavang, which is a thisness and an otherwiseness, or which is an alternation between a thisness and an otherwiseness. Sagati avijjaya eva. That going of them, that faring of them is only a journey of ignorance. Tanha dutiyo puriso, the man with craving as his second or his companion. Dighamadhana sangsarang, faring on for a long time in samsara. Ittha bhavanya tha bhavang sangsarang nati vattati. Does not get away from the round which is a thisness and an otherwiseness, or which is an alternation between a thisness and an otherwiseness. What is meant by it is the transcendence of samsara. We saw above how the concepts of a here arose with the birth of a whirlpool. In fact, one's birth is at the same time the birth of a here or this place. And that is what is meant by ittha bhava, the two verses quoted above. Ittha bhava and ittatta both mean thisness. In both verses, this thisness is coupled with an otherwiseness, anyatha bhava. Here too we see a conflict between two things, thisness and otherwiseness. The cycle of samsara represented by birth and death Jati Marana Samsara is equivalent to an alternation between thisness and otherwiseness. Vittabhava and Yathabhava. And as the first verse says, this recurrent alternation between thisness and otherwiseness is nothing but a journey of ignorance itself. Though we have given so much significance to the two terms, Ittabhava and Anyathabhava, the commentary to the Sutta Nipāta treats them lightly. It explains Ittabhavam as Imang Manusabhava, which means this state as a human being, and Anyathabhavam as Ito Avasesa Anyanikaya Bhava, any state of being other than this. This explanation misses the deeper significance of the word Itthattva. In support of this, we may refer to the Paṭika Sutta of the Dīgha Nikāya. There we are told that when the world system gets destroyed at the end of an year, some being or other gets reborn in an empty Brahma mansion, and after being there for a long time, thinks out of feeling of loneliness, Ahovata anyepi satta itthattang agaccheyum. How nice it would be if other beings also come to this state. In this context, the word Itthattva refers to the Brahma world and not the human world. From the point of view of the Brahmas, Itthattva refers to the Brahma world, and only for us here it means the human world. However, this is just a narrow meaning of the word Itthattva. When the reference is to the entire round of existence or samsara, Itthattva does not necessarily mean this human world. The two terms have a generic sense because they represent some basic principle. As in the case of a whirlpool, thisness is to be seen together with an otherwiseness. This illustrates the conflict characteristic of existence. Wherever a thisness arises, a possibility for an otherwiseness comes in. Ittabhava and Anyathabhava go together. Anicca or impermanence is very often explained with the help of the phrase Viparinamanyathabhava. Now here too we have the word Anyathabhava. Here the word preceding it gives a clue to its true significance. Viparinama is quite suggestive of a process of evolution. Strictly speaking, Parinama is evolution, and Parinata is the fully evolved or mature state. The prefix V stands for the anticlimax. Evolution is over, now it is becoming other. Ironically enough, this state of becoming other is known as otherwiseness, Anyathabhava. And so this twin, Ittabhava and Anyathabhava, tell us the nature of the world. Between them, they explain for us the law of impermanence. In the section of the trees in the Anguttara Nikāya, the three characteristics of a Sankhata are explained in this order. Upado Panyayati, Vayo Panyayati, Thitassa Anyathattang Panyayati. An arising is manifest, a passing away is manifest, and an otherwiseness in the persisting is manifest. This implies that the persistence is only apparent, and that is why it is mentioned last. There is an otherwiseness even in this apparently persistent. But later scholars prefer to speak of three stages as Upada, Thiti, Bhanga, arising, persistence, and breaking up. However, the law of impermanence could be sufficiently understood even with the help of two words, Ittabhava and Anyathabhava, thisness and otherwiseness. Very often we find the Buddha summing up the law of impermanence in the two words Samudaya and Vaya, arising and passing away. There is an apparent contradiction in the phrase Thitassa Anyathatta, but it reminds us of the fact that what the world takes as static or persisting is actually not so. The so-called static is from beginning to end an otherwiseness. Now if we are to relate this to the two links Jati and Jara Maranam in Paticcasamuppada, we may say that as soon as one is born, the process of otherwiseness sets in. Wherever there is birth, there is death. One of the traditional Pali verses on the reflections on death has the following meaningful lines. Uppattiya sahe vedang maranang agatang sada. Always death has come even with the birth itself. Just as in a conjoined pair, when one is drawn, the other follows. Even so, when birth is drawn in, decay and death follow as a matter of course. Before the advent of the Buddha, the world believed in the possibility of a birth devoid of decay and death. It believed in a form of existence devoid of grasping. Because of its ignorance of the pair-wise relatedness of this to that, idappaccayata, it went on with its deluded search. And that was the reason for all the conflict in the world. According to the teaching of the Buddha, the concept of birth is equivalent to the concept of a hair. As a matter of fact, this birth of a hair is like the first peg driven for the measurement of a world. Because of the pair-wise relationship, the very first birthday present that one gets as soon as one is born is death. The inevitable death that he is entitled to. This way we can understand the deeper significance of the two words, tabhava and anyathabhava, thisness and otherwiseness. We have to say the same thing with regard to the whirlpool. Apparently it has the power to control, to hold sway. Seen from a distance, the whirlpool is a center of activity with some controlling power. Now, one of the basic meanings of the concept of self is the ability to control, to hold sway. And a whirlpool too, as seen from a distance, seems to have this ability. Just as it appears automatic, so also it seems to have some power to control. But on deeper analysis, it reveals its not self-nature. What we have here is simply the conflict between the mainstream and the runaway current. It is the outcome of the conflict between two forces and not the work of just one force. It is a case of relatedness of this to that, idappaccayata. As one verse in the Bālavagga of the Dhammapada puts it, attahi attano natti, even oneself is not one's own. So even a whirlpool is not its own. There is nothing really automatic about it. This then is the dukkha, the suffering, the conflict, the unsatisfactoriness. What the world holds on to as existence is just a process of otherwiseness. As the Buddha vividly portrays for us in the following verse of the Nandavagga of the Udana. Ayang loko santapajato phasa pareto rogam vadati atato. Yena yena hi manyati tato tang hoti anyatha. Anyatha bhavi bhavasatto loko bhavapareto bhavameva abhinandati. Yadabhinandati tang bhayam jassa bhayati tang dukkham. Bhavavipahanaya kopanidam brahmacharyam musati. This anguished world, fully given to contact, speaks of a disease as self. In whatever terms it conceives of, even thereby it turns otherwise. The world attached to becoming, given fully to becoming, though becoming otherwise, yet delights in becoming. What it delights in is a fear. What it fears from is a suffering. But then this holy life is lived for the abandoning of that very becoming. Just a few lines, but how deep they go. The world is in anguish and is enslaved by contact. What it calls self is nothing but a disease. Manyati is a word of deeper significance. Manyana is conceiving and under the influence of craving, conceit and views. Whatever becomes an object of that conceiving, by that very conception it becomes otherwise. That is to say that an opportunity arises for an otherwiseness, even as death has come together with birth. So, conceiving or conception is itself the reason for otherwiseness. Before a thing becomes otherwise, it has to become a thing. And it becomes a thing only when attention is focused on it, under the influence of craving, conceit, and views. And it is separated from the whole world and grasped as a thing. And that is why it is said, Yan yanji lokasming upadyanti teneva maro anveti jantum. Whatever one grasps in the world, by that itself man pursues the being. The world is attached to becoming and is fully given to becoming. Therefore its very nature is otherwiseness, anyatha bhavi. And then the Buddha declares the inevitable outcome of this contradictory position. Yadabhinandati tang bhayam. Whatever one delights in, that is a fear, that is a danger. What one delights in is becoming, and that is a source of fear. And jassa bhayati tang dukkham. What one fears or is afraid of, that is suffering. And of what is one afraid? One is afraid of the otherwiseness of the thing that one holds on to as existing. So the otherwiseness is the suffering, and the thing grasped is a source of fear. For instance, when one is walking through a town with one's pockets full of gems, one is afraid because of the valuables in one's pockets. Even so, the existence that one delights in is a source of fear. What one fears is change or otherwiseness, and that is suffering. Therefore it is that this holy life is lived for the abandonment of that very becoming our existence. So from this quotation it becomes clear that the nature of existence is otherwiseness. It is the insight into this nature that is basic in the understanding of Idappaccayata. What is known as the arising of the Dhamma is the understanding of this predicament in worldly existence. But that Dhamma arises together with the solution for this predicament. Yankincha samute dhammang sabbantang nirodha dhamma. Whatever is of a nature to arise, all that is of a nature to cease. As far as the arising aspect is concerned, this whirlpool is formed due to the grasping through craving, conceit, and views. Once this samsaric whirlpool is formed, it keeps on attracting all that is in the world, all that is within its reach, in the form of craving and grasping. But there is a cessation to this process. It is possible to make it cease. Why? Because it is something arisen due to causes and conditions. Because it is a process based on two things, without a self to hold sway. That is why we have mentioned at the very outset that everything is impermanent, prepared and dependently arisen. Aniccaṃ saṅkhatāṃ paticcasamuppannaṃ. Every one of the 12 links in the formula, including ignorance, is dependently arisen. They are all arisen due to causes and conditions. They are not permanent. Aniccaṃ. They are only made up or prepared. Saṅkhatāṃ. The word saṅkhatāṃ is explained in various ways, but in short, it means something that is made up, prepared, or concocted by way of intention. Paticcasamuppannaṃ means conditionally arisen, and therefore it is of a nature to get destroyed. Kayadham. It is of a nature to pass away. Vayadham. It is of a nature to fade away. Viragadham. It is of a nature to cease. Nirodhadham. It seems that even the color or shade of decay and death can fade away, and that is why we have pointed out their relevance to the question of concepts. This nature of fading away is understood by one who has had an insight into the law of arising and cessation. Samsara is a whirlpool as far as the ordinary beings caught up in it are concerned. Now what about the arahants? How is the idea of this whirlpool presented in the case of the arahants? It is simply said that for them there is no whirling round for there to be a designation. Vattaṃ tesaṃ natthi paññāpana. So in their case there is no whirling round to justify a designation. This then is something deeper than the whirlpool itself. The whirlpool can be pointed out because of its activity, but not so easily the emancipated ones. And that is why there is so much controversy regarding the nature of the Tathāgata. The image of the whirlpool in its relation to the emancipated ones is beautifully presented in the following verse from the Chula Vagga of the Udana. Acceche vattaṃ vyagāni rāsaṃ visukkhā saritāṃ nasanti. Chinnaṃ vattaṃ navattati yesevanto dukkhasya. He has cut off the whirlpool and rid desirelessness. The stream dried up, now no longer flows. The whirlpool cut off, whirls no more. Even this is suffering self. What has the Arahant done? He has cut off the whirlpool. He has breathed it and has reached the desireless state. The stream of craving is dried up and flows no more. The whirlpool cut off at the root, no more whirls. This is the end of suffering. The cutting off of the whirlpool is the realization of cessation, which is Arahant. It is because of the accent on the arising aspect that the current tries to move against the mainstream. When that attempt is given up, the rest happens as a matter of course. This idea is even more clearly brought out by the following two verses in the Sagatha Vagga of the Samyutta Nikāya. They are in the form of a dialogue between a deity and the Buddha. The deity asks, Kuto sarani vattanti, katha vattang navattati, katha namancha rupancha asesam uparujjati. From where do currents turn back? Where whirls no more the whirlpool? Where is it that name and form is held in check in a way complete? The Buddha gives the answer in the following verse. Yatha pocha pathavi, tejo vayo nagadhati, ato sarani vattanti, ettha vattang navattati, ettha namancha rupancha asesam uparujjati. Where earth and water find we no footing find, from there it is that currents turn back. There the whirlpool whirls no more, and there it is that name and form is held in check in a way complete. The reference here is to Nibbāna. Whether it is called Sabba Sankhara Samatha, the stilling of preparations, the stilling of all preparations, or Asankhata Dhatu, the unprepared element, it means the state of cessation. And when the Arhat's mind is in that state, the four elements, which are like ghosts, do not haunt him. They do not get a footing in that consciousness. When they fade away due to detachment, those currents do not flow, and the whirlpool whirls no more. Name and form are fully held in check there. Now, as far as the meaning of Rupa in Nama Rupa in this reference is concerned, its definition as Chattaricha Mahabhutani Chatunnancha Mahabhutanam Upadaya Rupam is quite significant. It draws attention to the fact that the four great primaries underlie the concept of form. This is something unique, since before the advent of the Buddha, the world thought that in order to get away from Rupa, one has to grasp Arupa. But the irony of the situation is that even in Arupa, Rupa is implicit in a subtle form. Or in other words, Arupa takes Rupa for granted. Supposing someone walking in the darkness of the night has a hallucination of a devil and runs away to escape from it. He thinks he is running away from the devil, but he is taking the devil with him. The devil is in his mind. It is something imagined. Similarly, until the Buddha came into the scene, the worldlings grasped Arupa in order to get away from Rupa. But because of the dichotomy between Rupa and Arupa, even when they swung as far as the highest formless realms, they were still in bondage to sankharas or preparations. As soon as the momentum of their swing of sankharas got fully spent, they swung back to Rupa. So here too we see the question of duality and dichotomy. This sermon has served its purpose if it has drawn attention to the importance of the questions of duality, dichotomy, and the relatedness of this to that, idappacceta. So this is enough for today.